Well, the Olympics have left France, but a debate over the Games will likely linger in Paris for many years to come. Was it worth spending $10 billion? The Olympic baton gets passed on to Los Angeles next. We're joined now by Mike Bako, sports editor at the dailynational.com, to get his views on how Paris did as host of this year's Games. Mike, always good to see you. Well, as I said, Paris will have spent something like $10 billion on these Olympics. How does that compare with the other games, like the one, for instance, that was held in Tokyo?
That's the interesting point. So Paris was able to spend about $10 billion. They're actually probably going to be close to making a profit, while the Tokyo Games, now COVID-induced, lost about $800 million. So obviously it was delayed a year, so there were things that went into that. But I think the public consciousness around the Games in Paris was much different than, say, what was going on in Tokyo, where even before COVID, they were having slow ticket sales. They did not want it in their city. So there were a lot of factors that were going against it. The real sort of lasting benefit of this was highlighting Paris, highlighting the Eiffel Tower. Not that it needed that, obviously an international historical city, but the lasting benefits of it, a enthusiastic audience, having Celine Dion sing from the Eiffel Tower, having Tom Cruise help close out the opening ceremonies, everything that went on in the Seine, and honestly, everything that went on during the Games, it went off almost flawlessly. No bad venues, no horror stories at the Olympic Village like in past Games, say in Sochi or in other places. So this Olympics was really about, the focus was on the athletes and the events.
Mike, you say Paris could come out, or France could come out with a profit on this. Is that usual? Because, I'm thinking of the Games that were held many decades ago in Montreal, and they only paid that debt off a few years ago.
Yes, you hit it right there on the head. It took almost 3 decades to pay off that $126 million, debt. Montreal really wanted to vault itself onto the global stage during that Olympics, and it failed horribly. One of the great success stories was the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, that not only ended up in a profit, but the person who organized it, Peter Ueberroth, became Major League Baseball commissioner, but also Time Magazine's Man of the Year for how well everything went off. The thing that worked well in '84 and that they're hoping that will work well in 2028, next 4 years from now, Summer Games, is that they're utilizing so many of the facilities that are in and around the Los Angeles area. Multiple basketball stadiums, football stadiums, Olympic Stadium that's already there, swimming venues from world-class athletic centers at UCLA and USC, new basketball arenas that are there. So they didn't have to build anything, and that's where a lot of these cities go wrong, where they have to build these venues. Think back to Greece. That's where the phrase white elephant was first started, because of all these venues that just kind of went by the wayside. You see it also a lot when it comes to World Cup hosting as well, these single-use type stadiums that don't get used after the fact.
Right, of course, Paris is not a stranger to tourists, but these Games must have been a huge boon to the country in terms of tourism. We did hear, though, in our report, one of the taxi drivers complaining that his business was down 40%, but it must have been a huge boost for the tourism industry.
A huge boost for the tourism industry, obviously, just by having that influx of thousands of people that are coming in. But here's where the real benefit will lay, is that there was so much infrastructure that was built up, modernizing the subways, highways to get in and out of the cities. A lot of those things that are not very sexy, that kind of have a hard time passing during normal times in a major metropolitan area. Here in New York, when they were talking about doing the Olympic Games, that they eventually did not put in a bid for, a lot of it was going to be for the infrastructure, high-speed rail to take from outer boroughs coming in. So they did a lot of that infrastructure in Paris, and that's going to be one of the long-term benefits. Some of these cities that were not popular destinations now might become the Olympic Village city that was in a not the best area. Maybe now that kind of turns the corner with what that area can be. So while they had the influx of tourists, and it's great, the high-priced hotels and the restaurants and the different things like that, what you're really going to see is now, years and decades from now, where that mass transit is being put to use, not only by tourists, but also by locals.
Right, Mike, you talk about infrastructure and point out that, there is the risk of some of these things turning into white elephants. I'm thinking of a different sport, soccer in this instance, but I look at South Africa in 2010, which built all those very expensive stadiums around the country, most of which were not used after the World Cup. But in the case of Paris, will there be use for all this infrastructure that's been built?
That's what the hope is for. Now, if you look at some test case scenarios of cities that have done it well, it's about having the infrastructures in those buildings. And yes, maybe you have the swimming venue being used by school children to learn how to swim, but it's really about all those other things. Don't let the momentum die with just the Olympic Games. Atlanta in 1996 did an amazing job of this, of cultivating parks around where the Olympic Stadium was, highlighting the games. And now they have a great park system that was born off of a lot of the things that they did during the Olympics. 1992 with Barcelona completely transformed what that city could be, and they've had a lasting impact of it. So it's really about preserving those venues, not having overbuilt those venues, which I don't think that they really did, and kind of keeping those in the mix for not only local use, but also just not having it go into disrepair. These venues are pretty expensive to maintain.
Right, pretty expensive. And here's a question that we ask every time there's a big sports event like the Olympics, like the World Cup. Is it all worth it in the end?
Is it worth it? Is it worth it? I was going to take the words out of your mouth. In this case, yes. You know, for a lot of these cities, for a long time, the Olympic movement and the World Cup movement had a hard time generating bids that were coming up. I think what we've seen is that cities don't want to overspend. They don't want to start from zero. And also, I think the IOC wants to look at host cities that are not starting at zero. You don't need to have that stigma of, say, a Sochi or some of the other cities where they're hosting these games and they have no infrastructure and they have to spend $20–30 billion just to get up to speed. The IOC doesn't want the games being cloaked in that how much are these games costing. I think for Paris, this was certainly a highlight that will live. It's one of the formative games and hopefully something that jumpstarts the Olympic movement, not only from a popularity standpoint, but from cities bidding on it. Certainly here in the States on Peacock and on NBC, it was a ratings win all the way around. So a very popular games.
Thanks, Mike. Mike Bako there talking to us from New York.